I never imagined a luxury car would be the first thing to tell me my life was unraveling. I remember standing at the window of my office on a rain-swollen Tuesday afternoon, the city smeared into streaks of neon and asphalt, my phone buzzing insistently in my pocket with emails and false alarms. When I glanced down and saw the car parked under the sycamore in front of my house, black too new with that low, confident gleam that announces wealth before the driver steps out. And my stomach dropped the way it does when you realize you've missed the single crucial turn on a road you thought you knew by heart. For a second, I convinced myself it belonged to a neighbor, or to some delivery man, or to the kind of client who always shows up late and expensive. I told myself stories as I often did to soothe the quiet discontent. Then a text came from an unknown number, 2 words and a photo. The photo showing my front door ajar in the shape of a woman in the foyer, the woman I had married 7 years earlier, the one who had once traced constellations on my chest when insomnia took me, and the 2 words read casually, almost triumphantly, "Nice place." My hands went cold. I remember the elevator ride down as if it lasted minutes and hours, the city crowd becoming a blur, the bark of a taxi engine sharpening into a drumbeat that matched the fear I had been trying to ignore for months, small silences in bed, unanswered calls. The way her laughter in the evenings had become a practice thing with a tiny edge of distance that I kept rationalizing as stress. But when I rounded the corner of my street and the luxury car was there in all its arrogance, when I saw through my own living room window the flash of a hand on a shoulder, the careless intimacy of a head bowed too close to her neck, I saw not just an image but an accusation that in the time I'd been building our life, someone else had been buying moments inside it. I didn't make a scene. I wasn't the sort of man who raised his voice in public, and something in me was cold and precise rather than explosive. I watched them from the shadows as the lover, younger, with that insolent ease people cultivate when they are without long-term stakes, kissed her, and for a moment the world simplified and rearranged itself into 3 things: the woman I loved and did the man I had been, and the decision I would make next. The first decision was survival. I stepped back and drove to the office. No reckless confrontation, no half-baked threat. I sat in my car in the empty company lot and kept my hands flat on the steering wheel as if I was grounding myself. Then I went in, sat down at my desk, and did the thing that made everyone think I was still the same. I answered emails. I signed off on reports. I pretended the tremor under my skin was caffeine. There is a peculiar clarity that arrives with betrayal. The small, predictable anxieties fall away, and you are left with one sharp awareness that behaves like a compass. Mine pointed to exposure, not violence. Needed to know everything. I needed to see all the pieces and place them on the table. So I began to watch. I took the long way home that evening and found my driveway empty, the sycamore bearing a few fallen leaves like confessions, the neighbor's cat staring at me with its unblinking indifference. Inside, her shoes were lined up by the door the way she always kept them. On the console, someone had left a glass of wine still faintly perfumed with the citrus of a supermarket swizzle stick. The house smelled like familiarity and something else, an aftershave that wasn't mine. I didn't touch anything. Instead, I began the small, terrible work of seeing her life as a mosaic where every tessera might be a lie. I examined credit card statements where unfamiliar names floated like foreign bodies. I traced phone logs and found a pattern of short calls at odd hours. I scrolled through social media and saw the curated life she presented, and the comments the lovers coded notes of affection. But data can coldly indict without explaining motive, and I needed a face-to-face truth. I set a watch on our house for a few days, subtle and silent. I hired a gardener and a delivery that required signature, both pretexts to have people coming and going who might see what I couldn't. I told myself we were still married, that the legal architecture of our life would complicate any dramatic gesture. In my head, I kept a ledger of dignity and stress. When the lover returned the fourth evening, arriving alone and very late, I followed him at a distance and watched through a rain-splattered car window as he slipped a bouquet into the trash behind a convenience store, then climbed into a sedan and drove off in the direction of a part of town I didn't know well. That was when patience slid from a tactic to an obsession. I rented a small apartment in that neighborhood so I could watch without being noticed. I learned his habits. Coffee at dawn at a hole in the wall, cigarettes behind the bakery, a mother's photograph in the glove compartment. I learned his name by listening until it came out unguarded. I found his social media accounts and collected his friends and his small private joys. A dog he missed from childhood, a playlist full of songs about summer drives. And with each discovery, my plan grew less about revenge and more about reclaiming my life. My goals were modest in one sense and monumental in another. I wanted to expose the truth in a way that broke the lie but left me intact. It made her feel the weight of what she had chosen and gave me the power to rebuild with dignity. So I began to build a map of leverage. There was first the public domain, photos, timestamps, receipts. Second, the intimate domain, conversations and secrets. Third, the legal and financial domain, shared accounts, mortgages, a business contract that made her name necessary for certain transfers. I was careful to stay within the law. I am not a violent man, and the kind of public spectacle that ruins people instantly is the sort of thing I knew would ruin me too. My revenge would be surgical, not theatrical. Still, the nights were the worst, lying awake thinking of the many small moments we had spent together where I had been a partner in good faith. Renovating the kitchen, arguing about paint, the way she used to hum in the shower. I let myself grieve in the only way I could by turning pain into a plan. The first move was exposure to the people who mattered, not vindictive gossip, but a precise reveal to those whose opinions weighed on her. Her mother, who had always seen me as a son and who trusted me. Our mutual friends who would feel betrayed if they knew, and whose moral judgment would be perhaps more painful than any legal penalty. I wrote a letter that was raw but factual. No inventing of things that weren't true, no cruel embellishments, just dates and places and evidence. And I sent it to her mother with a request to meet. When her mother called me, the voice on the other end was a fragile, broken thing. She had always been a calm presence, and now she sounded like someone listening to a record of her life being rearranged. We met at a cafe where the light through the windows made everything look softer and grimmer. I handed her a copy of what I had compiled. She read with her hands trembling, and when she looked up at me, there was grief and a sort of disappointed fury that felt like wind through bare branches. She did not defend her daughter. She held the letter like a relic. That meeting did something unexpected. It softened some of the anger I felt into something colder and more efficient. Her mother reached out to her daughter the way mothers do, with a mixture of warning and pleading. And within days, my wife called me and asked to meet. The meeting was awkward and composed. She came with makeup that was too careful, with words that were rehearsed. She apologized in fragments. It's complicated. It didn't mean the same. She spoke of excitement and loneliness and small, monstrous things like boredom that can eat a marriage from the inside. I listened without theatric. I gave her a small inventory of things I knew, not as a trap but as a ledger. The look on her face when I mentioned the convenience store bouquet and the name of his dog was not surprise so much as the realization that we had both been caught in a net that was partly our own making. I proposed quietly to separate for a while. I said I needed time, space, the house to myself. She pleaded. She promised. I believed some of the promises because they were convenient to believe. Still, the basic algebra of our union, the mortgage, the company we had co-signed for a small bakery near the park, the joint assets, meant I needed legal counsel. I engaged a lawyer who was pragmatic and unromantic. She told me that the sharpest leverage I could use was not public shaming, but the steady enforcement of boundaries and the enforcement of financial separations. We drafted temporary agreements, assigned custody of the dog, a small mercy, and froze certain accounts. The lover, when he found out, became reckless. He left notes in our mailbox that were crude and entitled. He called my office once and asked to speak to me like I was a character in a story whose plot he would rewrite with arrogance. I never returned his calls. Instead, I let the legal engines run. But revenge has its own gravity, and in the spaces legal action doesn't reach, I had to make choices about what kind of person I wanted to be. I could have taken to social media and exposed names and photos and become the kind of spectacle that ruins all parties. Instead, I made choices that were quieter and, I hoped, sharper. I began to remodel the house on my own terms, which sounds banal but was profoundly symbolic, where before I had deferred to her taste. The pale curtains, the orchid on the sill, I installed a heavier door, painted the hallway an unrepentant gray, replaced knickknacks with objects that reflected me. Each small change reclaimed territory. I hired someone to take photographs of the house's transformation and posted them, not with malice, but with a calm assertion that life would continue. But will. The images went up with captions about renovation work and new beginnings. Friends liked them, strangers commented, and the lovers' anonymous messages grew rarer. My approach had a second, less visible component: kindness as strategy. I started volunteering in the evenings at a youth center, showing up for shifts assembling care packages, listening to teenagers who were angrier and more fragile than I had been. The work grounded me and taught me that the vastness of pain is not a commodity to be traded for revenge. It also introduced me to new people and a life outside the small orbit of my marriage. There was a woman there, a program coordinator named Lila, whose laugh entered the room like a bright object. She wasn't dramatic or feel-good. She was precise, funny in an efficient way, and she had the kind of steady eyes that made it hard to lie. We became friends slowly, with conversations held over cups of burnt institutional coffee. Her presence in my life was not a rebound but a calibration. She moved me away from the centrifugal pull of bitterness and reminded me that people can change trajectories. As the months unfurled, the lover's presence in my life became a diminished irritation. He still showed up in small inconveniences. A court summons when he refused to vacate the rented storage space where he had left boxes that included obscene notes and a sweater of mine, a terse exchange over property access. But these were handled with legal correspondence, not with scenes. The accumulation of evidence, the careful patient documentation, the ceaseless enforcement of boundaries, they did what loud anger cannot always do. They made betrayal expensive and inconvenient. There came a day 6 months after the first sighting of the car when everything pivoted toward the predictable and the painfully human. She sent me a message asking for mediation and acknowledging she had been selfish. The lover, it turned out, had a habit of speaking to mutual acquaintances, and in doing so revealed parts of the affair that made him look less like a mysterious romantic rival and more like a casual intruder in several people's lives. Small things, an offhand remark at a dinner party, an Instagram tag, stitched together in a pattern that made him less heroic and more petty. My wife, faced with the practical consequences of her choices, the potential of losing the house she loved, the desertion of friends, the coldness in her mother's eyes, backed away and asked for a negotiated settlement. I agreed because I wanted closure more than punishment. The settlement was fair but firm. I kept the house. She kept certain personal effects and the bakery share until it could be sold. and we agreed on a separation that included therapy and a path to divorce if reconciliation failed. But the real reckoning was not legal. It was emotional, sir. There were days I thought I wanted her to feel humiliation, days I wanted her to cry in the exact way I had felt inside. Then there were other days when I held my newborn niece and felt a tenderness that made cruelty feel like a cheap narcotic. Revenge, I discovered, can be a teacher. It shows you which parts of yourself you cannot bring back. I used the months of separation to create a ritual for my own healing. I wrote every morning in long, uncensored paragraphs that no one would see. I ran until my breath was small and efficient. I read books about strangers who rebuilt lives after collapse. I learned to cook because the act of chopping and simmering kept my hands from clenching into fists, and slowly the image of the luxury car lost its immediate thunder. It became a memory anchored to a season. That is not to say the wound closed without scar. There were moments of bitterness, anniversaries where the ache resettled in the soft places, songs on the radio that would suddenly make me feel twice my age. But there were also moments of growth that pleased me. I began to meet people who wanted me for what I had become rather than what I had been. I taught a class at the community college, a small but stubborn accomplishment that reminded me I had value beyond domestic status. In the final act of my strategy, the one I had been planning since the first sight of the car, I arranged a meeting not for revenge, but for accountability. We sat across from each other in the same cafe where I had once given her the letter. The light that day was different, thinner, more forgiving. I asked her simple questions about why she had left and what she had expected, and she answered with a weary honesty that had not been there before. She had been afraid of the routine, she said, afraid of losing herself in our life. And the lover had given her a glass bead of novelty that became an addiction. She admitted she had been cruel and that she had underestimated the cost. I told her, without theatrics, about the life we had built and how I had chosen to reclaim it with quiet things. The renovation, the legal boundaries, the kindness that wasn't performative but meant to keep me human. She listened with a small gratefulness and a deep regret. We did not reconcile in that conversation. Sometimes wounds are not stitches but careful seams. We agreed to divorce amicably, with a promise to be honest to ourselves and toward any future partners. The lover, removed from the narrative, faded like an unsatisfying chorus on a record. Months later, when the paperwork was final, I walked through the house at dusk and looked at the rooms that held our history. I thought of the rain that day I had first seen the car, the way the city had blurred into something that forced change. I thought of all the little victories that had nothing to do with punishing someone and everything to do with reclaiming my days. Dinners with friends who had stayed, a letter from my nephew who said our family was proud of how I had handled things. An email from Lila asking if I could lead a workshop. I felt unexpectedly free in a way that was not about being unburdened from memory, but about having learned how to carry it without it breaking me. Revenge, if it must be had, is often a temptation to become the thing you despise. I had avoided that by turning my energy to rebuilding and to small acts of dignity. There remain echoes. Once seeing the luxury car drive by our old street, I felt a flicker that was more curiosity than rage. What had become of him, the paramour who had hurried in and out? I learned later that he had moved cities and that the bravado of youth had left him with a collection of bad habits and fewer attachments. My former wife, over time, stopped being the axis of my stories and became, in memory, a complicated line on a map I had crossed. The end of my marriage did not erase the love I had felt. It simply transformed it into a lesson about the danger of taking another person for granted and the importance of mutual care. In telling this story as bluntly as possible, the car, the discovery, the slow, deliberate response, I do not want to glamorize betrayal or pretend I was nobler than I was. I was both vulnerable and calculating, hurt and humane. The revenge I enacted was not a single spectacular flourish, but a sequence of choices that protected what I valued and reclaimed my agency. Legal safeguards that kept me from losing my house, a public posture of calm that denied sensation-seeking onlookers the drama they desired, a personal commitment to grow rather than to destroy, and the slow rebuilding of a life that had been quietly eroded. If there is a moral, it is this. Betrayal often arrives as a shock that demands an immediate, violent answer. But the answer that endures is the one that reconstructs a life with integrity. I could have become bitter, spectacular in my ruin, but that would have only traded one shame for another. Instead, I chose to document the truth, to place it where necessary, to enforce boundaries, and to let the rest of the world see me continue. Years later, when I stand at the window of a different apartment and watch a car, perhaps a similar luxury model, glide by, I no longer feel the ache of being outpriced for affection. I have learned to recognize the feeling that used to propel me toward revenge and to convert it into something quieter, curiosity, caution, and a readiness to protect myself without wrecking others. The tale that began with a luxury car in front of my house ended not with a dramatic public unmasking, but with the slow, often invisible work of reclaiming self-respect, learning to trust cautiously, and allowing the possibility of new love that is rooted in honesty rather than escape. If someone asked me what it felt like to see your life threatened to be stolen in a single afternoon, I'd tell them the truth. It hurts like an animal wound, but it heals with the stubbornness of simple, repeated acts, paying bills, answering calls, showing up to work, learning to cook, sitting in rooms that used to echo with another's breath, and furnishing them with the small objects that tell you who you are alone. And when the vengeance is tempered by justice and the necessity to remain humane, you find that the worst thing that happened to you can also be the beginning of the life you choose rather than the life you were given.